Hey, in this video, we'll be looking at how to import data from a large Google Sheet in rows. For the purposes of this demo, I've created a Google Sheet and added some dummy data to it. It has 10 columns and 5,000 rows, along with one row for header. Before we could dive into the solution, let's take a closer look at the challenge. To start with, I'm going to type in Sheets URL in A1 and then copy this Sheets URL and paste it in B1. Normally, when you'd like to import any data from Google Sheets, all you'd have to do is type in equal sheets, navigate to get cells, Google Sheets function. I'm going to use our function wizard. For the URL, I'm going to use cell B1 as the input. And for the range, I'm just going to type in A:(J) and press add function in C1 button. Once the function is executed, you can then click on the yellow label, click on view data, navigate to all data, and here's where you'd find the number of values, or in this case, the number of rows that this function was able to fetch. In this case, it shows that to be 2200. However, this number might not be the same across every single workflow you may have, as it highly depends on the number of rows and the number of columns, along with the amount of content each cell has. The criteria that restricts the amount of data that can be fetched by any single function execution is our cell limit. To understand a little bit more about that, you could navigate to rows.com/docs, look up our platform limits, and here's where you'd find that number to be restricted to about 200,000 characters of values. I'm going to go ahead and close this. And to understand the amount of data cell C1 has, all I have to do is type in equals len and use C1 as the input. Here's where you can see that this number is a lot closer to the 200,000 value. Now that we've identified the challenge, the solution here would be to batch our requests in a way where we are only fetching a certain number of rows at a time and not the entire sheet. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and delete cell C1 and D1. In our cell A3, I'm going to type in range for the header. And to start with, I'm going to say, let's only pull in 1,000 rows of data starting at A1 to J1000. The function here, once again, would be the get cells Google Sheets function. I'm going to use our function wizard. For the URL, once again, I'm going to reference cell B1. In this case, though, I'm going to go ahead and lock this cell reference. And as for the range, I'm going to use cell A4 to be the input and keep that relative. Once good, you can then go ahead and click on the add function in B4 button. As soon as the function is executed, you can then click on the yellow label, click on view data, navigate to all data, and here's where you find we were able to fetch 1,000 rows. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this object and paste it in cell C4. Let's go ahead and give these columns headers as well. So this would be Sheets API, and C3 would be values. As a general best practice, I would also highly recommend to get a count of data that we were able to fetch. And for that, we'll use our parse function, use C4 to be the input, and then the length function to get the count of records that we were able to pull. I'm going to name this column count. As a final step in this stage of the process, all we need to do is insert the values onto our log table. But I don't want the entire row to be populated, but rather only from A1 to J1. I'm also going to lock these references and hit enter. I'm going to go ahead and name this add to log. Next, let's figure out a way to dynamically generate ranges that we could use as input in the subsequent function execution. For that, I'm going to go ahead and type in equals slice. As for the text input, that would be A4. The delimiter in this case would be the colon, and we would need the second position data here, which would be J1000. Since we don't want the J, I'm going to go ahead and use another slice, paste this formula again, use J as the delimiter, and fetch the data which is sitting in the first position. Now that's the count that we needed. Once we have that, let's go ahead and create the dynamic range reference. And for that, we can use concatenate, starting with the column A followed by 1000 plus 1, since we need the next batch to start right after the previous batch ended, followed by colon and J, and then the slice again, which in this case represents 1000. And then what we'll add to this is the number of records that we were able to fetch from our previous request. Next, let's go ahead and copy the sheets function right here. And let me go ahead and quickly check that. We'll have 1,000 values here. The first one is not the header. Let's go ahead and copy the values object right here. The thing to remember at this stage in the process is that we cannot directly use our insert function to push this data into a log table because it doesn't contain the same headers anymore. And to remedy that, we can always go back to our very first batch. I'm going to open up the values real quick and refer to the very first object, which is the headers right here. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and copy this object and temporarily paste it in D5. What we'll need to do is combine the data from D5, which should be the headers, along with the 1,000 rows of data, which is sitting in C5. However, at this stage, the data in D5 is not necessarily in the format that we need. So for that, all we need to do is use concatenate, start with open square brackets, then the parsed headers, and end with close square brackets, essentially creating a new array of data, which at the moment looks odd, but don't worry about it. And once we have this, we can then use this in our append function as to be the header, which is data 1, and the data 2 would be the next 1,000 values or the next 1,000 rows, which is sitting in C5. Once we have this object, we can also go ahead and just quickly view that. And you would see that there's one new record added here, which is essentially the header starting at the very beginning, followed by the rest of the data for the remaining rows. Let's go ahead and quickly clean this up a little bit. So in this case, I'm going to copy the values sitting in C5, replace the C5 input in D5 like so. I'm also going to cut the entire formula here and paste it in C5 instead. And finally, I'm also going to go ahead and lock the C4 reference right here. Let's go ahead and get the count and make that to be -1. And once we have that, let's go ahead and just insert the second set of data to our log table as well. All right, now that we have the ranges being generated dynamically, we can just select the entire row here and then just paste it one step below. You will see that the ranges were dynamic here. And this set of 1,000 records were also inserted in the log table. Let's do this one more time, and we'll get the next 1,000, which is up until 4,000 rows now being imported to our log table. Let's do it one more time. And here you'd find the data from row 4001 to 5,000 being imported and being added to your log table. Let's do this again. And finally, you'd see that there's only one record, which in this case is the reality, which is the 5,000 in the first row. And you'd find the last row data being 9,666.35. Let's verify if that's the data set that we have in our column J as well. And that's the number that we have here too, 9,666.35. Let's go back to the setup table and just quickly see what happens if you try and run this batching again. You will see that you'd have 0 data being pulled in, and that's what you to stop making new requests to import data. I hope this video helped, and thanks for watching.